It's my nerd world, and welcome to it, a Star Wars show. On this week's episode, continued commentary around Andor, specifically Episode 4, a show that I am quickly coming around on, and connecting the old with the new. Plus, we have your listener feedback this week. Let's not waste any more time and get to this week's Star Wars show.
Nothing will stand in our way.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I will finish what you started.
Who are you? I'm no one.
There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you.
My Nerd World.
Just let it in.
It is my nerd world, and welcome to it. I am your host, Jon Justice, here on a Star Wars show. It's really interesting to me right now, while we have so many fantasy-related series that are airing right now across multiple streaming platforms, and how the Andor series is falling into this as well, depending on what you watch. So the wife and I have been watching House of the Dragon, which I don't recommend for the most part, because I don't like recommending shows unless it's something that's, suitable for all ages, of which, Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon certainly isn't. Now, we enjoyed the show, although we find ourselves having to fast forward through particular portions of the show more often than we would like, just because it's content that we don't feel like partaking in. Be that as it may, House of the Dragon, of course, is a prequel to Game of Thrones and falling into the fantasy genre. On a more lighter note in terms of content, we also have The Rings of Power, the Lord of the Rings prequel series, doing that thing with my fingers, to what we know of the Hobbit story and the Lord of the Rings story. And on top of this, we obviously have Andor happening on Disney+. Andor, of course, not really falling into the fantasy element, but is relating to the other stories as it is widening out the scope of the existing content in a way that a lot of the other content does not. I've really come around on the Andor series. Having to move past my own, I don't know if bias is the right word, but my own desire to see a particular type of Star Wars storytelling. I've said many times on the show that if I had my way about things, if I was in charge of Star Wars, I would be moving forward beyond The Rise of Skywalker and telling a story, almost in the vein of a 10, 11, and 12 in terms of the Skywalker story, and continuing on the timeline with those fantasy elements that we've come to love, particularly in the original and prequel trilogy. When you look at Obi-Wan Kenobi, you have some of that as it relates to the Force. Little less so when it comes to the Book of Boba Fett and The Mandalorian. What I'm appreciating the most about Andor is the connectivity leading up to the original trilogy. And I want to talk a little bit more about that in my commentary of the series in and of itself. I've listed out a series of, I'm being redundant. I've put down a list of bullet points that I wanted to talk about on the show this week relating to Andor, and then we'll get into some of your listener feedback from either YouTube or you emailing me, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. The showrunners for Andor have been very open about the way that the story is being structured for Andor Season 1 and 2. I'm probably going to get this wrong about Season 2, but it relates to Season 1 in that Season 1 and Season 2 are each going to carry these 3 story arcs. So we'll get 4 3-story arcs in the 12 episodes for Season 1, and something similar is going to happen in Season 2. Season 2, however, will fill in during those arcs and in between those arcs large swaths of time. Right now, I believe we're about 5 years out from the Battle of Andor. We're going to close that gap through those story arcs in Season 2, whereas so far, in these first 3 episodes of Andor, they are taking place in a very, linear fashion. Episode 4 picks up right where Episode 3 ends. Now, if you listened to last week's episode, I was a little trepidatious in my opinion of the show, and I really have warmed up to what the show is. And as I said earlier, and I'm being a bit redundant here, but it really is coming across, it really was, for me, more a matter of getting used to what type of story we were being told. And less about the actual content of what we were watching. This is Star Wars that isn't Star Wars to a certain extent. Episode 4 kind of closed the gap for me on that and is leaning in closer to what we got in Rogue One with mentions of the Force and specifically kyber crystals, and we'll get into this in just a moment. But clearly, this show is filled with a lot of intrigue. They were very open before the show was released in that this was going to be more of a spy thriller type of show. And as we're watching it, it is a bit of a slow burn. That being said, each episode has left me immediately wanting more, not wanting the episode to end. I find myself, and this happened during episode 4, of actually pausing the show briefly to see how much longer we had in the show because I was enjoying it so much and I didn't want it to end. One of the complaints over the first 3 episodes that I didn't necessarily have, but I know other people did, but it was an observation, and I even put it in the title of the podcast last week, and that is, Star Wars that's not Star Wars. I was looking at that from a standpoint of there wasn't anything that was immediately jumping out as being from Star Wars. Yes, you had spaceships. Yes, you had clothing designs and building designs that certainly fit within the Star Wars aesthetic. But we didn't have the Empire yet. We didn't see stormtroopers. We were seeing this other security force that was a rung down from the Empire. And apart from Cassian Andor, there really wasn't any major indicators within the episodes of things you could immediately identify as being from Star Wars. Now, that obviously completely changed in an instant as we got into episode 4. There were a lot of fans complaining in the first 3 episodes that there was a lack of connectivity that, along the same lines of what I was saying, but more specifics. There was nothing that Andor was doing to relate to other parts of Star Wars. Again, episode 4 completely nuked that idea. There was tons of connectivity to canon and legends. And so much so that I could spend the whole episode going through all of the various references from, again, canon and legends that was inside of the episode. I'll name a few that stuck out to me. When Luthen gave Andor on his Fondor, what did they call it? A Fondor Hall ship. I love that ship, by the way. Still having a hard time sort of wrapping my head around exactly what it looks like. The episodes haven't given us like a good 360 view of it, and there hasn't been anything released about Luthen's ship yet. But I really love that vehicle design. But when they were on that ship at the end of episode 3 and then at the beginning of episode 4 as they jumped to hyperspace, Luthen gave Cassian a kyber crystal, looking very similar to the one we saw in Rogue One that Jyn Erso had. This one being a little bit bigger, had blue attached to it, and with it was a story of his retrieving this from Rakatan Raiders, in the battle as it relates to it. That is a direct reference to the Knights of the Old Republic video game, this kyber crystal that Luthen gives to Andor. Inside of Luthen's gallery on Coruscant, there was a very clear reference to Starkiller's armor as it was seen in the Force Unleashed video games. Within Luthen's gallery, there was half a dozen other references that people picked up on that, again, point to legends and canon. We heard the mention of oh my gosh, and now his name escaped. Oh, Sly Moore, excuse me, her name. We hear the mention of Sly Moore in the episode, of course, going back to the prequel trilogy, and one of the officials closest to Emperor Palpatine. Of course, being on Coruscant in and of itself is an immediate connection to not only the prequels but the end of Return of the Jedi. So clearly, the showrunner got with the story group because he's admitted, Tony Gilroy, that he himself is not a massive Star Wars fan, but clearly he's hooked up with them to provide the fans with what they were looking for as it relates to references to publications, video games, and previous movies. What I think I love most about the show right now is something that I also love about Rogue One. And this relates back to what Rings of Power is doing by filling in a lot of gaps in the history of Lord of the Rings, what House of the Dragon is doing as it relates to the original story that was told in Game of Thrones. I love how Andor is filling in this gap of time between episodes 3 and 4, and it will lead, knowing it's going to lead right up to the events of Rogue One, which of course then leads right up to the events of A New Hope. It's one of the things that I really do appreciate about The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi is that we end one story and immediately pick up with the next story. With Andor, Rogue One, and then the original trilogy, we now have one big connected story that if you wanted, you could start off by watching Andor and then just watch them all the way through Rogue One and A New Hope. I find that really interesting and unique, and aesthetically, it's going to flow very well. Andor looks a lot like Rogue One. At the end of Rogue One, the production designers and the director did their due diligence to try to match the aesthetic of A New Hope at the very end of that movie so that it would seem rather seamless when Rogue One would roll into A New Hope were you to go and watch those back to back. And again, as somebody that wasn't clamoring and isn't clamoring for more stories to be told in this particular timeline, I do really love the fact that here we have a story that is going to end more, that is going to lend more connectivity to A New Hope. There were complaints from when Revenge of the Sith was released on home video, and we saw the deleted scenes from that film. One of the most significant deleted scenes from Revenge of the Sith was the Mon Mothma scene with Padme and a group of other leaders in the Senate who were essentially sitting down together and forming what would be one of the first meetings as it relates to the rebellion that became so infamous in the original trilogy. What I'm really digging about Andor is now we're actually getting more than just that particular scene. We're getting the same actress from Revenge of the Sith, who looks strikingly similar to the woman that played Mon Mothma in Return of the Jedi. Many Bothans died to bring us this information. And we're getting a full backstory on the beginnings of the rebellion, which also adds to what we know from Rebels. I loved the intrigue of Mon Mothma showing up at Luthen's gallery, and Luthen's assistant in the gallery, who we've seen in trailers wearing a hood and maroon clothing. I'm pretty sure this is the same woman. Obviously is going to, if that's the case, play a more significant role in the series. But she distracts the driver, if you will, of the shuttle or ship that Mon Mothma took to Luthen's gallery as they go back and, speak covertly about funding the rebellion. We get Mon Mothma coming home to her husband, finding that there are dinner guests coming over that she has had staunch disagreements with as it relates to the workings of the Senate. I'm really loving this adult intrigue coming out of this movie, the double life of both Luthen and Mon Mothma. I thought the scene of Luthen on his ship, changing his clothing, putting on a wig to take on his other persona on Coruscant, and actually sort of taking a moment and getting into character. I found that really, really engaging. And Stellan Skarsgård is just doing a fantastic job. It's actually one of the other compliments that I have on this show is that every single main character is chewing up the scene in terms of dialogue, and I want to see more of them. The woman that is so reluctant to bring Cassian, who is going by the name Clem of his adopted father, who was the man that found Cassian along with the woman on that downed Republic cruiser in the flashback scenes from the original episodes. But the woman in charge of this group that's going to go and take on and try to steal the funding from this Imperial base, her reluctancy to bring him in, but then is the one who owns it with the group of rebels, emerging rebels, to hide Luthen's involvement in all of it. I mean, it's just some of the best writing that we've gotten in Star Wars in such a long time. And I'll say it again, it really casts a looming shadow on Obi-Wan Kenobi and what, in my opinion, Kenobi could have been. I am shocked that we are watching Andor, and this was produced by the same people that ended up doing Kenobi. Kenobi is a show and a story that should have had the same type of love, attention, and detail that Andor has, and I simply don't understand that. Getting to Andor joining that group, the group reluctant to bring him in for this mission. Again, we're not getting a lot of adventure. There's certainly not any fantasy in the show, but what we are getting is just an incredible amount of intrigue and interesting interpersonal dynamics from these characters that are so very unique to each other, and each of them has their own clear little backstory. Whether we find out about it or not remains to be seen, but I'll watch any of these characters. And by the end of episode 4, I was desperate to keep watching. It was almost as if we were watching like another version of Rogue One with this group that's going to go and take on the Empire and try to pull off this heist. Coruscant. I was a little taken aback at how different Coruscant looked in the Andor series, but also assumed that this is by choice. Now that the Empire is growing, we're not getting the rich, vibrant look of Coruscant that we got from the prequel trilogy. Now, Andor also doesn't really lend itself to that. The style of the prequels was very specific to the prequels. And that being said, it might have been jarring if we had come into Coruscant on a night scene to see it as vibrant and colorful as we're so used to seeing from the prequel trilogy. But again, the connectivity and the adding of context to not just Coruscant, but also A New Hope. One of the things that I've loved about the stories that have been placed before A New Hope and Rogue One has been the level of depth that it adds to a movie that came out in 1977. Seeing the inner workings of the ISB, Imperial Security Bureau. The semi-benign scene, if you will, although relevant and compelling, from A New Hope with Tarkin and Vader and other Imperial officers on the Death Star at right around the midpoint of A New Hope, now carries more value, more weight, and more context now that we've seen the ISB in action on Coruscant and how the dynamics of what's the word that what's the word? Seniority. How the dynamics of seniority between the upper officers and the lower officers play out. And I very much expect that we're going to get the same in terms of that connectivity and that context when we end up in the Senate scenes that we've seen in some of the trailers that will look like the prequels on Coruscant. Very much looking forward to that as well. Again, it's not an adventure for the most part. Certainly not fantasy, but it is, so far in these 4 episodes, been great storytelling that enriches the original and prequel trilogies. And for that, I really am enjoying it for what it is. Is it anything, is it a show that I've been asking for? No. But is it a show that I'm absolutely enjoying? Yeah, I am. And it is probably closest to something that I have desired, and I've said as much on the show, and that is a live-action Star Wars show that plays out much in the same way of Game of Thrones in terms of multiple storylines, intrigue, character dialogue. That's what Andor is is delivering, and the way that every episode has kind of ramped up and becomes closer and closer to what we typically see in Star Wars, and certainly got there in episode 4, with so much time being spent with the Empire, seeing the workings of the Empire in a way that we haven't before, and at the same time getting this more complete backstory of how this rebellion is forming against the Empire. What are their feelings towards the Empire? What are their motivations for it? So I am just really excited, and it's one of the few times when I'm actually going to kind of argue to a certain extent. I think it's smart of Disney to release these episodes once a week, but at the same time, boy, I'm desperate to watch all of them. I almost wish they would have just spread it out over 4 weeks and just given us each week those 3 story arcs, like we get like an hour and a half little mini movie. But, Disney and Lucasfilm understand the importance of being able to slowly dish this out to the audience, knowing that podcasts like this one are going to take time to go and talk about each and every episode, which I also think and believe is very important to the fandom as well. What do you think? As always, leave a comment up on YouTube or drop me an email via TalkShowNerd@gmail.com.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
All right, first we hear from, you're all friends of the show, but first we hear from SheVP, who writes, "So happy to hear your voice again, John, and happy you're doing well. Totally agree with your assessment of Andor. It did get off to a slow start, but I'm looking forward to what the future episodes hold. And I'm excited to see Coruscant. A review in The Hollywood Reporter stated that this show wasn't for the Baby Yoda crowd, and while I didn't think they needed to explicitly imply that 2 people were about to get intimate on the show or show us that the S word is also used in a galaxy far, far away, as a proud member of the Baby Yoda crowd, I thought it was pretty cool." Yeah, take it or leave it. I think they did a good job of sort of riding that line. You wouldn't realize that they were in a brothel at the beginning of episode 1 unless you were really, really paying attention. In my household, it's a little less relevant. I have a 15-year-old going on 16 in December and a 20-year-old, so they're at an age now where they can deal with such things. But be that as it may, this isn't a show that I think a lot of parents are going to be showing their little kids. And at the same time, even if they did, I think the kids would be bored and probably walk away and want to go do something else. JC Val 93 writes, "I'm going to have to watch again the first 2 episodes. We're way too slow. I'm hoping the pace will pick up. And looking forward to the rest of the season overall. I feel like this program had a dystopian feel to it, like Soylent Green crossed with Star Wars and Blade Runner. It's an interesting combination. Bottom line, I really believe that Jon Favreau, Dave Filoni, etc., somebody will have some new material for a new feature film for the big screen, say before 2027, the 50th anniversary of Star Wars. Sorry, can't call it episode 4 A New Hope. Keep up the good work and get well." Thank you, JC. I do appreciate it. And lastly, friend of the show, Miranda, who is definitely in my thoughts right now, as is her family. "I cannot even begin to tell you how absolutely happy I am right now. And I mean happy in a different way. I made a prediction to myself that the absolute best thing that Andor can do is try not to please everyone or become some crowd pleaser, and try to bring Star Wars to another level, to take it to the next level, to be different and really hit it out of the major leagues. And so far, I've been right. And we're only 3 episodes in. I loved Book of Boba Fett and the Kenobi series. They were 2 examples of classic, typical Star Wars content in the Star Wars timeline. Book of Boba Fett came in almost kind of shy with its marketing. Nobody really knew what they wanted out of it, except hoping that it was semi-decent, and it was. But I think we could have done a little better than semi-decent show that turned out to be somewhat good because of Big Daddy Mando and Grogu. Also known as the one who pays for Lucasfilm and Disney's rent to keep the lights on. The Kenobi series, it was always going to have a lot of hype and expectations going for it and be an Easter egg hunt. And I have a few things that fans want or have been asking and wanting since the end of the prequels, and feel like an event. In all fairness, it had moments of strength and weaknesses. It had a lot of weaknesses, and its biggest weakness was its writing and executions and trying to please everybody. Andor, on the other hand, is coming in not really asking to be anything and not asking to be the most beloved Star Wars series ever, because it gave them what fans wanted, or become a feel-good entertainment. It's not interested in that. It just wants to tell a good story and bring some grit. Not that Star Wars never had grit or violence, but just needed to take it to another level, and it did. So far, it did. You know, the other thing that I really like about Andor as well is that it is bringing back this sense of a threat, for me personally, it is bringing back this sense of a threat of the Empire. I remember growing up as a kid with A New Hope, and, you know, the Empire was this oppressive regime, and it was scary from that standpoint, especially at that point in time growing up when you think about the time of the Cold War and concerns over communism. As a kid watching Star Wars, again, the Empire was just somebody, a group of individuals you didn't want to cross. That's really been diminished over time, in my opinion. They attempted to do a bit of that in the sequel trilogy with the First Order, especially when you consider scenes in the Rise of Skywalker, when the First Order is going through and knocking on the doors of Kijimi. But, you know, that oppressive threat of the Empire had kind of diminished. Andor, in its tone and execution, and certainly with Episode 4, is bringing that back. The dynamics between the officers, the brutalist look of the portions of Coruscant that we're seeing, the concern that Cassian had with the woman as they're traipsing across the mountain to meet the rest of the group that's going to try to go and pull off this heist. When the TIE fighters come screaming overhead and they're concerned hiding behind the rocks, you felt the weight and that fear of the Empire. You know, you become so used to something and seeing something, it loses a bit of that shock and concern. And I feel like Andor is really bringing that back, not only in the way they're depicting the Empire, but also in the way that these characters are so concerned and wanting to fight back and risk their lives to push back on the Empire as well. So I really appreciate that. And again, how that is going to relate when going back and watching the original trilogy. I really can't express enough how much joy that brings me as a Star Wars fan that's been living with that original trilogy, you know, and certainly the first film since I was 5 years old. So for 45 years, I've been living with Star Wars. To have new content that can actually make A New Hope feel fresh again when watching it and bring to mind the images and the storylines of what we're being given now in these new Star Wars series. You know, Kenobi wasn't going to do that. I wish that it was, but just the way that Kenobi, again, and I feel like I keep, you know, sort of harping on the show. I'll watch Kenobi again, but I was disappointed. And Kenobi just didn't carry itself in terms of its production value to something that really expanded my thought process as it relates to either the prequels, which it was closer to than the original trilogy. Maybe I'll feel differently. I haven't gone and watched the prequels since I watched Kenobi, so perhaps I'll think, you know, perhaps it will bring more thoughts of that show as I watch the dynamic between Anakin and Obi-Wan in the prequels, but that still remains to be seen. All right, that wraps up the show this week. Thank you so much for checking out My Nerd World, a Star Wars show. If you are listening to the show for the first time and you read sci-fi, stick around for just a moment. I want to talk a bit about my science fiction series because selling books is hard. If you or a family member are into science fiction, I would encourage you to help support My Nerd World by going to mynerdworld.net or amazon.com. Treat yourself, a friend, or a family member with science fiction written for adults but great for ages 11 years old and older. I wrote this 7-book complete series because of my love of Star Wars, set in a future time on Earth. Follow a ragtag squadron of pilots and one reluctant hero on a journey of survival through the far reaches of space as they fight for humanity's future among the stars. Book 1 is the opening story of how humanity left Earth. Taft has found something and humanity won't survive without it. As Earth meets its end, the battle for the stars begins. The only thing that matters to Taft Guardia, as much as his beloved ship, is fellow pilot Keith Amaro. He'll need both more than he can imagine when a freak industrial accident sends the planet spiraling towards the apocalypse. Taft soon finds himself unwittingly attached to an emerging galactic conflict as factions form and battle lines are drawn during the global evacuation. Earth's evacuees face annihilation and will push man and machine to their limits. Yet, having uncovered what may be the key to their survival, Taft might be humanity's last hope for a future among the stars. If you like your science fiction space opera to be epic, filled with a little bit of romance and action, EMBARK is perfect for you. And again, great for ages 11 plus, even though it's written for adults. The content is totally appropriate for younger readers. You can find it on Amazon.com. Look for EMBARK, Jon Justice, or at mynerdworld.net. Again, thank you so much for checking out the show this week. The book series is available in ebook, hardcover, paperback, and audiobook. Special pricing on the ebooks as well, including book 1 at a discounted price, and the opening trilogy of the story also discounted to sell as well. We'll be back again next week to talk about episode 5 of Andor. Until then, I hope wherever you are happy, you are healthy, and you are safe. I'll talk to you real soon. Bye.
The Force will be with you. Always.
My Nerd World.